I will introduce Dr. Gustafson, our featured speaker, keynote speaker. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Sciences at the University of Utah. Her research aims to understand how children develop the ability to listen in complex acoustic environments, especially classrooms, including how children allocate their cognitive resources while listening. She's also interested in describing how hearing loss and assistive technology influences the success of this process. So we're thrilled to have Dr. Gustafson present. Thank you.
Um, all right, so thank you, Kathleen, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here virtually today with you to talk about listening effort and listening related fatigue and who we might consider at risk. So before I begin with the content, just some relevant disclosures here. I am employed by the University of Utah. I do have a small portion of my salary supported by a training grant from the U.S. Department of Education that focuses on training pediatric and educational audiologists alongside teachers of the deaf. Um, some relevant non-financial relationships. I am a member of a number of professional organizations and separate committees of those organizations. And I do serve as a peer reviewer for several academic journals. So on to the good, well, almost on to the good stuff. So I live in Salt Lake City, Utah. That's where University of Utah is located. For those of you not familiar with where we are located, it's this red pin right here in the Mountain West. Um, University of Utah is embedded just at the foothills of the Wasatch Mountains. So we have an incredibly beautiful view all months of the year. It looks a lot like this right now, where we're getting a ton of snow, but that means there's a lot of winter sports and activities to do. In the summertime, we get to play on those same mountains, but in the grass with the wildflowers, which is really nice. And when you head down to the southern part of the state, it's a completely different environment. We have red rocks with a lot of really great geological features like Arches National Park here, and then several different fun hiking adventures. Here is me and my son hiking back in October when the leaves were changing and we were starting to get a little bit of snow in the mountains. So lots of cool stuff to do in Utah. If you're ever out that way, please come visit and explore all we have to offer. So today in the first talk, I'm going to talk about the consequences of classroom listening. And then we are going to really dig into listening related fatigue and how we define and understand it. We're going to work to compare and contrast the terms fatigue versus effort. And then we're going to go through what the research shows us that causes listening effort to be increased in children. And then later on in the session today, I will talk a little bit more about some practical tips for supporting children. So the first talk today is really just kind of setting the stage of what the problem is. So, most of you have probably spent a little bit of time in classrooms, if nothing else, but as a student yourself. But we know that classroom listening is very challenging, and children spend 80% of their school day listening to speech in noise. Noise can come from lots of different places in a classroom. We have an open door here in this classroom. Let me see if I can get a pointer here. We have an open door here in this classroom that can obviously have hallway noise leak in. We've got a flat surface for the floors, and the chairs scooching back and forth can cause significant noise. We have the heating and ventilation system that can introduce noise into the classroom, and of course, the overhead lights or any other equipment that's in the classroom. The children themselves are often a pretty significant noise source in a classroom. And now that we have such technology driven classrooms, we often have these charging stations where children can put their laptops or their tablets in to charge when they're not using them. And these stations often come with very loud fans to make sure that the batteries don't overheat. And that can be a significant source of noise in a classroom as well. And just another reminder that children themselves, even when they're working in small groups, can be pretty loud sources of noise. And this matters because we know that children are more negatively impacted by noise than adults when they're listening to speech. And this ability to understand speech when there are a lot of other competing sounds, it continues to develop until really late adolescence. So our children are really vulnerable as they make their way through the entire school system. So we have regulations or suggested regulations for our classroom noise environment. So the American National Standards Institute has a recommendation that unoccupied classrooms, meaning no children or humans present, should not exceed a certain overall noise level. And that really gets at the heating and ventilation and any sort of traffic noise from a nearby freeway or train station. But we also know that even though we have those recommendations, almost all classrooms do not meet those recommendations. They exceed those unoccupied noise levels. And we know that classrooms where specialized instruction takes place, maybe a pull out special education classroom or a makeshift classroom to do some additional testing, those classrooms are typically louder than our general education classrooms. And we also know that lower grade classrooms are much noisier than higher grade classrooms, typically because children are louder when they're younger. And we know that all occupied classrooms are noisy. Up to a quarter of our classrooms that have children in them have overall levels that exceed 70 dB SPL. And that number is significant because we know from early research that that is about when all conversations become difficult to hear, even for adults who don't have any hearing difficulty. So this is a really big challenge for our children because, of course, in these classrooms, we're asking them to sit there and learn, and they're doing a lot of sustained listening in these noisy environments. So, some work that I did when I was a PhD student at Vanderbilt really wanted to understand what the consequences of this type of sustained listening might be for children. So we designed an experiment that brought children into the lab on a weekday, or excuse me, a weekend or a non-school day. They were with us for about 3 to 3.5 hours, and they did a series of experiments that would allow us to measure their cognitive processing by measuring their brain responses at the beginning of the test session and at the end of those 3 hours. We also measured their attention lapses. So, how many times did their mind wander off when they were supposed to be doing something? And we asked about their symptoms of fatigue with a really simple 5 question survey. And these questions are listed here. So, I feel tired. They had to rate that on a scale of 1 to 5. It's easy for me to do these things. My head hurts. It's hard for me to pay attention. And I have trouble thinking. And we asked them to report their fatigue symptoms and we measured their attention lapses before they did an hour and a half of difficult speech processing and after they did that hour and a half of sustained listening in a classroom like environment. So I'm going to walk through what we found before and after the difficult sustained listening in these 3 areas: cognitive processing, attention lapses, and fatiguing symptoms. And we tested children who were school age, they were 6 to 12-year-olds. Children he had either typical hearing or they had mild to moderately severe hearing loss. These were your more traditional hearing aid candidates rather than cochlear implant users. So, looking at our cognitive processing, as I mentioned before, we measured the electrical responses to the brain. So, this young man here is wearing a sponge cap. So, each of those white dots here has a little sponge that has an electrode in it that's only measuring electrical responses from his head. And I used to call it our spaghetti cap because it just looks like a bunch of spaghetti coming out of the head. And what we're looking at is the ability to discriminate between two different syllables, ba and ga. And so there's two lines here presented on this figure here. And the solid line is the brain's response to the syllable that doesn't happen very often. And usually that gives us this nice response that says, oh, that's something different. And the gray line is the response to the sound that happens all the time. So we want to see this dark black line be above the gray line. That means that the child could adequately discriminate between the two speech sounds. And in our typical hearing children, you can see that in this window, the dotted window here, that's where we're looking. You can see that they were able to discriminate the infrequent sound from the frequent sound. For our children who are deaf and hard of hearing, we also saw that ability to discriminate between the infrequent sound and the frequent sound. But after they listened to those speech processing tasks, you can see that that discrimination ability went away. And so we understand this to mean that the cognitive processing that is required to remember what sound you've been listening to and then pick up on the fact that something new happened, which is a really important process for learning, that cognitive processing is reduced following just an hour and a half of sustained speech processing. And that's true for children who have hearing loss and children who don't. So this is just kind of the consequence of that sustained listening on our cognitive processing across all children in the school age range. When we look at attention lapses, we had children monitor a screen. So this was a non-listening task. They had to watch the numbers start ticking up in quantity on the screen, and then they had to push the space bar really quickly to stop those numbers. And their goal was to get as fast as possible, and we measured how many times they forgot to push the space bar as our attention lapses. So these are times when the child was supposed to be paying attention, but instead their mind just kind of wandered and they forgot what they were supposed to be doing. And you can see that children with normal hearing and children who had hearing loss and did not use hearing aids, or those who did use hearing aids, had relatively few attention lapses before that sustained listening task. But we see a nearly twofold increase in attention lapses after that sustained listening. And again, there were no differences between the children with typical hearing and the children who are deaf or hard of hearing. So that tells us that all children um, show increased attention lapses after these sustained listening periods. When we ask them about their fatiguing symptoms using our 5 question scale here, we see an increase in symptoms. So here on the fatigue rating, lower means that they're more fatigued. So before, all 3 groups were reporting a little but not much fatigue. And then after the sustained listening test, we had an overall reduction in number, which means increased fatiguing symptoms after that sustained listening. Again, no differences between the 3 groups. So this tells us that these consequences of cognitive processing and attention lapses and feelings of fatigue are happening for all children in our classrooms. So let's dig a little bit further into this concept of fatigue. Fatigue is really common. Often we describe fatigue as what's called a mood state. So it's a feeling of tiredness or weariness. We maybe just feel sleepy or exhausted, like we have a lack of energy. It affects us in several different areas of our life. So if you've ever done a really hard workout, you've experienced physical fatigue or muscle fatigue. We can have social and emotional fatigue, and also we can be mentally fatigued as well. There are 2 types of fatigue when we really start to dig into problematic fatigue. The first is transient fatigue, and this is fatigue that we experience on a day to day basis. So, transient fatigue comes and goes. You can usually get rid of it with a brief little nap or perhaps a couple deep breathing exercises. Recurrent severe fatigue is the big issue. So, recurrent and severe fatigue is something that sticks with someone for a long period of time, and it's very consequential to their daily lives. So we often see this in unhealthy populations, um, like people who are battling chronic health conditions like cancer, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, things that really make it challenging to live a daily life. And fatigue is a problem because we have a lot of research that shows it has problematic results for behavior. So there's been a lot of fatigue research done in the workforce. So when when people go to work really fatigued, like that chronic fatigue, there's an association with higher stress levels, greater inattention, reduced concentration. Sounds kind of familiar from our classroom study. We see slower cognitive processing speed. Adults are less productive. They're more prone to making accidents at work. So, 3 Mile Island was caused by a worker being fatigued. We have people who report a poorer quality of life, that they're more isolated because they choose to be less active. When we get into the lower portion of this list here, these are studies that have been done with children. So we see children who are battling chronic health conditions have chronic fatigue, and they have more school absences, they have higher stress levels, lower school achievement, and increased risk for developing mental and emotional disorders. So, none of these research studies had anything to do with children or adults for that matter who are deaf or hard of hearing. These are all just chronic fatigue in a, we'll say, typically hearing or unnoted hearing population. And over the last 10 years or so, we've had a lot of research that has come out about fatigue in children who are deaf and hard of hearing. So here's a figure from Ben Hornsby that came out in a book chapter a couple years ago. And what he's done on this figure here is plot the PedsQL MFS total fatigue score. So this is a fatigue scale that was developed for use with children who are battling cancer to monitor their fatigue levels. And what this group did was we measured fatigue in children who are deaf and hard of hearing using this other scale. So this scale wasn't made for children who have hearing loss. This was made for children who are experiencing fatigue for other reasons. But when we look at the children who are deaf or hard of hearing, their fatigue is pretty significant. So again, lower on the fatigue y-axis means that the child is reporting more fatigue symptoms. And what Ben Hornsby's group here did is line up the scores on this same measure of children who have other chronic health conditions. So these are children who are battling cancer, who are chronically obese, have diabetes, short stature, rheumatoid arthritis, irritable bowel disease. All of these children are reporting less fatigue than the children who have hearing loss in the Vanderbilt data, which is really significant. So that showed us that we really need to start paying attention to fatigue in children who are deaf or hard of hearing. So, we've come up with this term called listening related fatigue. We want to make sure that we're not talking about fatigue related to battling cancer or some other chronic health condition, but really the fatigue that comes from that difficult listening experience. So, listening related fatigue is a type of fatigue that's associated with the application of your effort to understand whatever you're trying to understand during a listening task. So, very specific to a listening task. Listening in complex environments requires people who are deaf or hard of hearing and people who have language delays to allocate additional cognitive resources, put forth more energy in that mental space to that auditory task in order to complete that speech understanding goal. And when we measure the listening related fatigue in children with hearing loss, we see that children who are deaf or hard of hearing are 2 to 2.5 times more likely to experience moderate to severe listening related fatigue than their peers who have typical hearing. Um, so on this figure here, this is kind of a summary of several different studies that have been done across ages. So at the top panel, we have adult ratings, and you can see adults with hearing loss are 9 times more likely to report severe or moderately severe listening related fatigue than the adults without hearing loss. When we ask parents about their children who are deaf and hard of hearing, we see 5 times more moderate and severe fatigue than children who do not have hearing loss. And when we ask the children themselves, we see that they themselves report 2 times more fatigue than their peers without hearing loss. And I want to pause here because there has been some research that's been coming out lately that shows that this is not the severity of fatigue is not related to the severity of the child's hearing loss. We've seen that both adults and children, we don't see more listening related fatigue and more severe hearing loss or in more mild hearing loss. There's no association that we've found between degree of hearing loss or even configuration of hearing loss. Children with one good ear and one hearing loss ear still report significantly more listening related fatigue than children without. So, listening related fatigue really is a problem for all children with hearing loss, regardless of the degree or the configuration. So the group at Vanderbilt, led by Ben Hornsby and Fred Bess, they wanted to understand more about this listening related fatigue concept. So Hillary Davis is a research audiologist in Nashville, Tennessee. She is also an educational audiologist, so this is a topic very near and dear to her heart for all of the students that she works with. And they conducted focus groups with 88 people to better understand this concept of listening related fatigue. They talked with 43 children who are deaf and hard of hearing. They also talked with parents who have children who are deaf and hard of hearing, and teachers and school professionals who work with children in this group. And it turns out the listening related fatigue is very complicated. So, this is their theoretical framework that they've published in the 2021 paper. And I'm just going to highlight some specific portions that I think are relevant to our discussions today. So, when they think about things that are related or that cause listening related fatigue, they use the term situational determinants. So these are just things um, that people in these focus groups thought that, or they identified as being causal determinants or leading to listening related fatigue. So, background noise, probably no surprise, was one of the most commonly reported fatigue related problems from this focus group. Um, we had children and their parents and teachers reporting that videos and phone calls were fatiguing because of the poor audibility or the lack of consistent visual cues. I think Zoom and the pandemic and shifting us into this virtual environment has helped little bit with that. Um, Children described both internal and external pressure to do well in school as leading to listening related fatigue. A lot reported that they had more fatigue at the end of the school day or the week. They associated multitasking with being something that leads to listening related fatigue. And they found that students that had greater internal motivation were also the ones that reported more fatigue. So there seems to be this complex interaction with motivation and the development of fatigue that we're still learning about. People also in these focus groups, both children and their parents and teachers, noted that sometimes when the children aren't using their prescribed amplification devices, that they think that that leads to listening related fatigue. We're going to talk later today about whether or not the research agrees with that. So, how is listening related fatigue experienced by these focus group participants? They found that most older children, so these were kids ages about 6 to 17, so the whole school age child range. And most older children were able to describe that feeling of tiredness and exhaustion that we talked about earlier. The parents reported that their children had more headaches and required more after school rest. So, this is something that I heard a lot when I was working with this group, just anecdotally from our parents of the students who came to participate in our studies. You'd have a fourth grader who wanted to take a nap every day after school, which is not typical behavior of a fourth grade student. The students reported difficulty concentrating and sometimes a reduction in motivation because they were so tired. And also, parents and teachers reported attention and behavior problems in the classroom. And then everybody reported frustration and other negative emotional signs of listening related fatigue. So, in these focus group discussions, coping strategies always sort of bubble to the surface. And coping strategies that were identified by the children included things like asking for modifications, so asking the teacher to repeat the content of the lecture, or perhaps um, asking to have the notes ahead of time. Um, these kinds of environmental modifications were reported also by teachers. Children and teachers reported listening breaks as something that the children used to cope with listening related fatigue. So, whether or not they were taking a break from the listening activity by getting up and leaving the classroom, or children reported a lot that they would just take out their hearing devices and give themselves a listening break. Children reported the difficulty in choosing whether or not they wanted to push through their listening related fatigue or simply withdraw from the listening task, which of course has negative consequences for our academic performance. Parents reported that a lot of children were avoiding their complex listening environment. So perhaps asking to leave the birthday party early or skip it entirely because it was at a really noisy cafeteria. And then, of course, our classroom modifications like remote microphone systems and preferential seating, which we'll talk a little bit more about later today. We also heard a lot about barriers to utilizing these coping strategies. So, children would report getting into trouble or missing important information if they took a listening break, either by leaving the room or choosing to zone out themselves. And then, of course, negative academic and psychosocial effects. And interestingly, parents and professionals were much more aware of these barriers than the children themselves. So, even though the children were reporting that they were taking the coping strategies, um, the parents and teachers were the ones who saw the consequences or the barriers to them using these coping strategies. So, we learned a lot about the listening related fatigue experience of children in classrooms from that Davis study. And we think that listening related fatigue is a direct consequence of applied listening effort under certain conditions. And this construct of fatigue can be applied to many different areas. So instead of listening, you could replace muscle in there, and talk about athletes running a race. So high levels of effort is going to lead to the higher likelihood that fatigue is going to develop. And we know that fatigue experiences of children who are deaf or hard of hearing are impacted by both internal and external factors. So it's not just the classroom noise that is the factor, it's also the motivation of the child and where that pressure to listen comes from. Interestingly, they found that high listening effort leads to fatigue more so when the person is doing a internally driven goal. So if you're watching or excuse me, the high listening effort is higher when you're doing a required task rather than a task that you are more intrinsically motivated to complete. So, listening to a lecture is more fatiguing than watching an interesting movie, even if audibility in both is a challenge. And so, that speaks to the fact that this motivation to listen has a really important role in this listening related fatigue. And Hilary Davis quotes in her paper that high levels of listening effort that are required to remain engaged and attentive in a classroom might increase a child's risk for developing listening related fatigue. So that leads me to the rest of what we're going to talk about this morning, which is listening effort. So, listening effort is a specific form of mental effort that occurs when a task involves listening. So, it's that cognitive energy that you're using to try to listen. And we know that children who are deaf and hard of hearing consistently demonstrate greater listening effort than their peers with typical hearing. And again, this is not just in children who have bilateral severe to profound hearing loss. These are also minimal mild losses, unilateral losses. So this is all children with hearing loss. The research has shown demonstrates greater listening effort than the children who don't have hearing loss. So I'm going to walk through a list um, of things that increase listening effort for children, and then we're going to kind of wrap it up to understand why listening effort is so high in a classroom environment, and that situation is so ripe for development of listening related fatigue. So we'll start with the likely and favorite culprit, competing noise. So there's a really well established relationship between listening effort and competing noise. This is a classic figure that we refer to often in the listening effort research area. So here we have a response time task. So how quickly can you respond to something? So longer response times means it's a harder, more effortful task. Lower or early response times means that it's easy. A lot of less effort is needed. And then along the x-axis here, we have the signal to noise ratio. So we have really difficult listening environments over on the left-hand side and really easy environments over on the right. And you can see that as the environment is really easy, we have really low response times, meaning less effort. But as our listening situation gets more difficult with a decreasing signal to noise ratio, then our response times get longer and longer until it's just too hard for us to do and we give up and we see this roll off of of behavior where people just give up. And some of the focus group data that the Vanderbilt group shows that adults report and some children even report just withdrawing from a situation when it's too difficult. So we use the same type of behavioral task to measure listening effort in children who are deaf and hard of hearing and children who have typical hearing. So again, we have longer response times are indications of greater listening effort. Less response time means fast, easy listening. So you can see that as our signal to noise ratio gets harder, we see elongated response times, even in the children who have typical hearing. But you can see in general, our children who are deaf or hard of hearing have increased response times, greater listening effort than the children who have typical hearing. We also know that age plays a role in listening effort experiences. So, as children go through elementary school, listening effort decreases. Excuse me. So, younger children report more listening effort or experience more listening effort than older children. You can see this nice relationship here. So, the gray here are our typical hearing control norms for this task, and then each triangle is a child who uses at least one cochlear implant. And we see this effect of age just like we do with the children who have typical hearing. In noise, things get a little bit more difficult for the children with who are using a cochlear implant, which is expected. But in general, younger children, more effortful listening. The vocal quality of the teacher also matters for listening effort. So, this group out of Sweden tested school age children, so 6 to 13-year-olds, who either used hearing aids or cochlear implants. And they listened to a typical voice of a teacher and a dysphonic voice. So, these are the kinds of traditional modifications that are made by a teacher in a noisy classroom. So, we all tend to speak a little louder when the classroom gets noisy, and we also may use more harsh vocal qualities. So when we look at the average ratings of effort, so higher on this figure means less effort, lower means more effort. The children who are deaf and hard of hearing in this group it rated it more effortful to listen to that dysphonic voice, which again is the traditional modifications that teachers make in noisy classrooms where they're teaching all the time. Another group in this group in a different study tested almost 108-year-old children who have typical hearing in background noise on a sentence test that got harder and harder and harder as the trials went on. So here we have on the x-axis the easiest sentence and then the hardest sentence all the way over to the right. A higher response time again means more listening effort. And you can see as the task got harder, it became more effortful to listen to that dysphonic voice, that those teacher modifications. So even just the nature of having a noisy classroom has cascading impacts for listening effort, because then the teacher is going to change their voice quality, and that is going to compound with the effect of background noise on listening effort for the children. Language experience also matters. And so here in this study, they used a different metric of listening effort. They used something called pupil dilation. So when we're working really hard to do something, our pupils tend to get bigger and bigger with more concentration. So in this figure, you're looking at time on the x-axis and pupil size plotted here. So as time goes on, when we're listening in noise, our pupil size gets bigger and bigger because it's much more difficult. But that doesn't happen in quiet because it's a very easy listening situation. So greater pupil increase means more effort in this study. So they looked at children who were native Swedish speakers, and they wanted to know native speakers versus non or native listeners versus non-native listeners. how much listening effort did they show in quiet compared to noise? And so we don't see any difference between our quiet and noise in the gray and the blue, respectively, here for our native listeners. So, children listening to someone speaking in their native language. But if children were listening to someone speaking in a different language that they knew but wasn't their first language, we see that noise causes increased listening effort for these non-native listeners. So this has really important implications, not just for our children who are deaf and hard of hearing, but also children who are learning a second language that is used in the classroom, which is the case for a lot of children in across the world, but especially here in the United States. As you might expect, face masks are we're starting to see affect listening effort. So we've all experienced this before, but I'll go through it just the same. So here we have a waveform of speech. So um, choose to see here, and you have the energy of no face mask versus a fabric face mask contrasted here. So all of the blue that you see here, that is speech energy that is missing when you put a fabric face mask on. And in this figure here, these are just, this is a spectrogram of the frequency of the information that is passed through a face mask when someone is talking. So you can see in the blue here, that's our no mask condition. That means we've got a lot of good energy across the frequency spectrum here. But of course, we're blocking a lot of that sound, especially that high frequency sound where consonants live, with our different kinds of face masks here. So um, the recent research just came out this past year that looked at listening effort in an unmasked versus a masked condition. And when we look at children or when we look at adults, we see an increase in listening effort as adults are listening to the face mask condition compared to the no mask condition. And now we have data that shows we see that same trend in children with who are typically hearing. So this is also, again, important to understand in context because not only have we increased the noise in the classroom, had the teacher be making modifications that make it more difficult to listen, but in a lot of cases in the last 3 or 4 years, we have also reduced visual cues and caused some of this sound energy covering up that increases listening effort for our children. There haven't been any studies that have looked at the effect of listening effort of masks on listening effort in children who are deaf and hard of hearing. I know that some are happening, but they have not been published yet. Reverberation and distance in the classroom is one that we like to talk a lot about in the classroom acoustics world. And so the results on listening effort and reverberation in children are pretty mixed. And so in this figure here, this is an image from this PACU study here. So greater response times mean more listening effort, lower mean less listening effort. And she tested in low reverberation and moderate reverberation in school age children, did not find any effect of reverberation on listening effort. But a recent study by Prati and Vincentin showed that we see an increase in listening effort with more moderate reverberation times in classroom noise, but we don't see it in quiet. So noise is really where reverberation gets all of its power. And again, in the older children, we see that maybe they've just stopped trying because it has gotten so hard. So in general, our research findings are a little inconclusive. We do have a brand new study out of the PACU lab at Vanderbilt that shows in adults that listening effort is affected by reverberation if the listener is farther away outside of that critical distance where the reverberation crosses over the direct sound of the speaker. And so a lot of more work needs to be done in this space in children. But we know reverberation could be a problem. It's just the research really hasn't figured out how to capture that isolated effect of reverberation and distance compared to the large effect that we know happens with noise. So there's a lot of things that increase listening effort. So we've talked about how hearing loss increases listening effort regardless of how many ears you have hearing loss in and what degree and configuration it is. We know competing noise is a big culprit for increasing listening effort. Younger children have greater listening effort than older children. Children who are listening to a non-native speech have higher listening effort. The natural modifications made by teachers in noisy classroom can make listening more effortful. Of course, face masks make listening more effortful. Some evidence to suggest reverberation and distance influences listening effort. And there's probably a lot of other factors that we don't know about yet. And so if you're starting to feel really discouraged, you're not alone. When I look at this body of literature as a whole, it's amazing to me how children learn anything in our classroom environments these days. And so there's a lot of work that we still need to do. And later today, we are going to talk about what we know from the research and what anecdotally tools we have that you can use in your classrooms, in your clinics with your children to help support them in the areas of listening related fatigue and listening effort. So, with that, I will open it up to questions.
Fabulous talk. Thank you, Dr. Gustafson. So, if you can use your phone to activate the QR code, and the passcode is CCC 2023.
Okay, so the first question that I see is why are specialized classrooms noisier? This is a good question. So, from what I understand, reading the literature, it's because typically specialized classrooms are not made when traditional classrooms are made. And so when school buildings are constructed, they follow whatever acoustic and construction guidelines are in place at the time. And a lot of times those buildings, especially older buildings, did not consider that they needed to have specialized classrooms for those pull-out services. And so if you've ever been in a specialized classrooms, like I taught special ed for a little bit as a substitute teacher, and my classroom was a very large closet, so not designed for classroom instruction in the slightest bit. And so I think that that is why those specialized classrooms tend to be noisier. The other thing that the literature shows is that the temporary classrooms are a lot noisier than the permanent classrooms. So any of the temporary like pod like buildings that schools are using for classrooms are also going to be much noisier. But it's really important to understand that if you are doing pull out services in a special classroom with a child who needs good acoustic quality of a signal, which is really all children, but for sure children with who are deaf and hard of hearing, we want to make sure that you're giving them the best opportunity to access the content, and that might mean using remote microphone technology or contacting your local educational audiologist and having them come and do a measurement in that classroom that you're being assigned so that you can go to the administration and say, look, this isn't quiet enough for what I'm doing with this child. What connection is there between the problem of deaf hearing among children and noise pollution? So there is a lot of research out of the UK that looks at this problem of noise pollution. So much of it doesn't have anything to do with the deaf and hard of hearing population. They're really more looking at differences in socioeconomic status of schools that are, say, next to an airfield or next to, large freeway systems. And they found that that type of noise pollution, where it's loud, continuous noise all the time, actually has reductions in cognitive development for children. Again, I haven't seen anything about noise pollution and children who are deaf and hard of hearing, but it is a problem when there is constant loud noise that the child is exposed to. Okay, any research or ideas on how hearing age or how long one has been amplified? That's a really good question. Affects user listening effort. So we might expect that the less time someone has had being able to experience their listening device, that they would experience more effort. I don't think anyone has actually looked at that. I think that that would be a really difficult study to put together, mainly because when we speak about hearing aids, usually um, we're talking about children who were usually implanted or amplified very young. And so by the time they get to school age where they can actually do the listening effort tasks in the research lab or give us a rating of their effort using a survey, those effects of hearing age, I would assume, are going to interact with things like language exposure at home. Do they have a family who gives them really rich language input, or a family who doesn't have that opportunity? We know that early and consistent amplification use leads, or cochlear implant use leads to better outcomes. And so hearing age would you'd almost have to calculate a weighted dosage measure of how early did they get their device, how often did they use it, but then also what was the quality of linguistic input that they got. And so you could control for all of that in your listening effort study. We tried to answer that, or we tried to start looking at that question with the Vanderbilt data, and it was just much too messy. There's so many factors that go in, or that are potential confounds for looking at the effect of listening effort. But by the time we accounted for all of the things like age of identification, age of amplification, um, duration of use, right? Have they used it all day, every day, or did they only use it a couple times, a couple hours a day? Then there was no more data to account for because everything was already so messy. Have there been any specific studies looking at listening effort in students with and without personal um, so personal DM, I'm assuming you're talking about remote microphone in the classroom. We are going to talk about that in my second talk. How can we support parents of young children using hearing aids when they see symptoms of listening fatigue? What is our message to them? This is just the theme of the day. I'm going to give some tips for that in my second talk. So, as I mentioned, the first talk was really here's the problem. And then the second talk is what can we do about it? Um, I suspect, though, that what I'm going to have to say is going to be less impactful than what our panelists are going to have to talk with us about before my second talk. But I do have some thoughts and some tips about how to talk with parents about listening related fatigue and how to help them talk with their teachers and their education systems about it. And we'll go through all of that in the second talk. What are your opinions of use of noise reduction signal processing technology in hearing aids for our pediatric patients? This is a great question. Noise reduction signal processing is actually how I got into hearing aid, or to research with children in general. And we now have a number of studies that have looked at noise reduction. And the effect on the pediatric population. We do not have any evidence to suggest that you should not use it for the pediatric population. We have had no studies that have shown it reduces speech perception, which is our primary goal, right? We want that speech to be audible. And in all the studies that have been done, we've never found a reduction in speech recognition or perception for children with noise reduction. There's a great study that just came out of Cincinnati Children's Hospital where they did um, a a double blinded trial of hearing aids, and one group of children received hearing aids with that type of signal processing. Another group of children received hearing aids without that type of signal processing, and they measured so many different outcomes, including speech perception. They measured behavior on research tasks, they measured parent report, they measured academics, and they found absolutely no difference between using that processing and not using that processing. So I always recommend to our local audiologists that they should use it because it can increase comfort in those loud, noisy environments where children typically are. Um, with confidence that it's not going to reduce their audibility for speech. Our signal processing technology has gotten so great that I don't think we need to worry about that anymore. The only thing I do talk with our pediatric audiologists about is when to implement that technology. So it really depends on the environment of the child. So if you've got a young child who spends most of their time at home because they're, say, birth to 3 years of age, they are typically not going to benefit from that type of technology. So there's no need to engage it. But once a child starts going into a more noisy environment, it can really help with comfort of the sound. And there's some there's some anecdotal evidence, or not really evidence, it's just reports from parents that say their children stop wanting to remove the devices more when that technology is engaged, just because it is less loud. And that's certainly something we do see in the adult data. Is there research for listening effort and fatigue for students in open schools? Um, Not that I have seen. Yeah, short answer. I haven't seen anything looking at listening effort or fatigue in open schools. Most of the listening effort with respect to open environments is in office settings. Do you know if anyone is researching listening fatigue with students with APD? I do not know, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means that I'm not the person they would tell that that's what they're doing. I haven't seen anything in the literature. If I had, I would have included it in this previous talk. And so nothing's been published about listening related fatigue. There's been a couple reports trying to get at this issue in children who have autism. So not APD, but another group of children with special listening needs. Aaron Schaefer at University of North Texas is doing a lot of research and writing about using assistive technology for children with special listening needs. And I know the Educational Audiology Association is working on a position statement for that as well. Is there work or research that considers coaching that builds the child's understanding of listening effort in addition to coaching families and teams? Not that I know of, but this is what we need. This is kind of the next step. So, as you probably know, it lags what we actually need, right? We have to spend a lot of time to describe the problem, make sure we understand what it is, and then we can start researching how to intervene, and then, excuse me, how to implement that intervention. And so, at the beginning of the next talk, we're going to talk about the very, very few research studies that have started to look at whether or not interventions work, or whether or not those coping strategies actually reduce listening effort and listening related fatigue. Spoiler alert, there's not very many research studies. Um, and so I think what we really need is a very large study that uses two groups of families, and one of the families gets this listening effort and listening fatigue focused counseling, and one that doesn't. The audiology community is not very good at doing that kind of research. It is a big downfall for us. And so I'm not aware of anything. I'm also not aware of anybody doing that work right now. Do you know of any hearing loss simulation that has different noise levels of specific signal to noise ratios so we could give parents and teachers an idea? Oh, there are so many. Um, there are so many different simulators. A lot of the hearing aid companies have good simulators, but there have been a ton that have come up in the last 5 years or so. Um, I don't have any favorites off the top of my head. I can see if I can come up with a couple and maybe send them to send them to the CCC team and they can push them out to everybody. Um, the ones that I've used in my class, like the Phonak has a good one, Starkey has a good one, but there are a lot of really great ones. The Verifit has a really good simulator, but again, noise isn't accounted for in there. You can always play noise in your room if you have a Verifit and show how that happens. There's a computer program called Sharp that the Boys Town National Research Hospital group put out, I think, like when I was a baby, but they've been updating it. So SHRP, and it allows you to calculate the aided audibility of a signal in different distances and positions for the child with different noises. And so I've used that a lot with counseling. I teach my students about that in class. And so that's another option.
All right, we have two more questions and then we'll take a break.
Can you describe some examples of teachers using dysphonic voices? So it's really anything that happens when you are trying to speak over a crowd. So when you are raising your voice, the spectral content of your voice changes a little bit. It becomes more high frequency rather than low frequency because you're stressing a little bit more. So the quality of the signal is different in addition to the spectral content, and high frequencies are more difficult to hear than low frequencies. And then just the resonance of your voice is going to change as well. And so it's not something that teachers are doing on purpose. It's not a voluntary thing. It's a natural response to speaking over something, like a noisy classroom. Am I aware of any research in terms of listening effort and mental health in adolescents, or listening fatigue and mental health? I am not. This is something that we are just starting to understand in the adult population. So there's some really good research coming out of Jack Holman's lab. I think most of it was his PhD work that looks at listening fatigue in adults who are receiving hearing aids for the first time and how that is associated with their social emotional health and their level of activity. To my knowledge, no one has taken that into the adolescent space yet, but I think it's really important that we do that. There's Kelsey Klein is at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, I believe, and we're going to talk about some data she shared at ASHA in the next talk. And she did a big survey of adolescents who are deaf and hard of hearing, asking them about listening related fatigue. And so she may have some data from that survey in that space, because I know that's a topic she's interested in, but it's not published yet.
Thank you so much. That brings us to our break.